Okay. If not, we use this one. It's another good idea. Could have been mine. Sir, do you know if this is being recorded? It is being recorded. So it is good that we use the microphone. And maybe, okay. Okay, very quickly, because from now on it is being recorded. We have a nice little research project with the World Maritime University about what would the world be without shipping. It's an ongoing project where George, Max, another colleague, Simona, myself are working on, but it's ongoing. So we cannot really present much of results as yet. But as I said, we are really happy to have lots of different people in the room, on the podium, as panelists, as speakers, and you in the room. There are no right or wrong answers. It is really a brainstorming session in that sense. We have two presentations. Max will start with something more on the ships, and Nigel will speak more about what is on the ships, with a focus on containerized. Yeah. So there we will have two presentations, which together maybe 20 minutes or so, with some charts and data, and this is already very fascinating. Then I will give the floor to our panelists who have prepared themselves a little bit with some numbers, but I really would like to ask you to just throw 3-4 sentences, so not a presentation, but like from your angle, your experience. I know you had a case like it's not a theoretical case, you already know a real case where an island was without shipping, so a different experience we will bring in, and hopefully, if your moderator doesn't talk too long and too much, we might have time for some further interaction. We must stop at 3 o'clock sharp, as you know, because there are parallel sessions and other commitments. Without any further ado, I don't know if this microphone now works or whether you want to use this one also.
Thank you, Jan. Thanks, Jan, for the kind introduction, and also a warm welcome from my side. I must say it's a real pleasure being here with all of you and seeing you. My name is Maximilian Weidenhammer, and I'm a maritime transport consultant for UNCTAD. And a few weeks ago, in early May, Jan and George approached myself and together with a colleague of mine from the World Bank to do an interesting assignment. What would the world be without global maritime trade? And yeah, as said, UNCTAD and the World Maritime University embarked us on this journey. And answering this hypothetical question is certainly not easy, and that's probably why Jan made an entire assignment out of it. And as he mentioned before, the work is still in progress, and hence I will not present all the results today. Actually, I would also like to use the session as an additional input for our paper, and ideally my presentation will provide a good starting point for the subsequent discussion on stage, and I'm excited to hear the view of our panelists on stage. But what I can do today is give you a picture of how the world looks like as we have it today with shipping, and how dependent we are on maritime trade. So let's start with a look from space. Each of these dots represents a commercial seaport, and each line is representing a shipping lane. These routes allow for the efficient transportation of goods globally and thereby connect our world. We are so used to this scenario. Actually, we are so used to it that we cannot even imagine how it would be without ships. We take shipping for granted. And let me put this into perspective. What are the things that we're just taking for granted? I'm sure many of us are familiar with this number. 70% of all goods are transported by ships, measured by value. If measured by volume, this number even goes up to 80%. And with these figures in mind, I'm confident to say that shipping is the backbone of global supply chains. Shipping provides the transportation of goods in high volumes at low costs. And looking at that a little closer, we can see that especially the global south is critically dependent on efficient, low-cost maritime transport. 55% of the seaborne exports are lifted in developing countries, and 61% of the imports are unloaded in the developing world. Let us have a look at some statistics that underline what I've just said. We have been analyzing data from the UNCTAD Trade and Transport dataset, and these bars are showing the value of food imports per transport mode grouped by the regions. The bright orange here is representing maritime shipping. And at first sight, it's obvious that across all regions, more than half of the food imports arrive through the seaway, with Europe being an outlier where most food is imported by roads. It comes with no surprise that countries in Oceania are heavily dependent on maritime transportation of goods. And overall, it's interesting to note that more than 50% of all global food imports are arriving on ships. And also speaking about food, I think this is good food for thought for the panel discussion. I would like to go a little more granular and have a look at the food imports in the global south. Again, the orange share is representing sea transportation. And while the general message remains the same, that all economies are heavily dependent on maritime trade, I would like to highlight once again the dependency of developing countries on shipping. Especially low-income economies, as well as islanded and landlocked countries, would immediately suffer from the absence of maritime trade, as they are simply lacking a low-cost alternative, or an alternative at all. Shipping is therefore the imminent lifeline for many small island states, but also landlocked countries, which import essential goods like energy and food supplies. By no surprise, most of the fuel is imported by sea, due to the large quantities required to run a country. Please note that these bars are excluding pipelines. So there are 31 countries in the member states in the International Energy Agency, IEA. And each of these member countries is required to ensure emergency oil stock levels of no less than 90 days of their net imports to respond to severe supply chain disruptions. But what happens if there are no imports of fuel arriving in port anymore? And also, what about the countries that do not keep emergency stocks on fuel? As it can be seen at the graph, 89% of the global fuel imports arrive by ships. And apart from the few net exporting countries of fuel, the rest of the world is implicitly dependent on the fuel imports by sea. One more thing on the global energy imports. Last July, the International Maritime Organization, IMO, has agreed that shipping has to reach net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050, which leaves the sector with less than 3 decades on the route to zero. And in fact, this is a big challenge we all have embarked on. While the shipping sector itself is undergoing an energy transition by switching to alternative marine fuels, ships will also transport the alternative clean energy, such as green methanol and green ammonia, from their production sites to demand centers around the globe. Thereby, shipping will also be an enabler for other sectors to decarbonize and eventually play a vital role in the global energy transition. And let me put this boldly, there is no energy transition without shipping. So interactions between the energy sector and the shipping industry are key for success of new supply chains and an energy transition that is compatible with limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees. On the other hand, maritime shipping is also an enabler for trade and development, as this slide helps us to recognize. So what are the actual commodities that are traded at sea? I'm sure Nigel will go into this as well, but as per the Review of Maritime Transport 2023, by far the most traded commodity is dry bulk, with fuels being the runner-up, followed by containerized goods. And looking at the gray overlay in the graph, the demand for all commodities is expected to grow from 2024 to 2028 by the total seaborne trade. By 2%, I'm sorry. Looking at the distance traveled, grain is the good that travels the farthest. Since 2018, the distance of overseas transportation of vital goods, just like grain, has significantly increased. And since 2019, the grain supplies are traveling more than 7,000 nautical miles, which is about the flight distance from Barbados to Dubai. This is showing the growing dependency on global interconnectedness, and not least a movement towards offshoring of certain goods. While the annual growth rate of the world fleet has been declining over the past decade, the overall tonnage of the market has grown year by year. In 2023, it has almost reached 2.3 billion deadweight tons. And for those who are not familiar with the shipping terminology, deadweight tons is referring to the cargo carrying capacity of ships. Anyway, what does that mean, 2.3 billion tons of cargo capacity? I admit it's a number hard to grasp and even harder to compare with, but, well, also admitting that this is not very scientific, but hence it probably did not make it in the review of maritime transport. However, the cargo carrying capacity of all commercial vessels globally matches 4 times the weight of the Great Wall of China. At last, I would like to return to a map that displays ship movements. Or actually, there are no ship movements, and it seems like someone has just pressed pause. So picture that in your head, and now imagine that this picture would turn into reality. And with that question, I would like to turn to our panelists and ask them, what would the world be like without shipping, if that picture turns into reality? Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name's Nigel Pusey. Yep. Sorry, it's there. Good afternoon. My name's Nigel Pusey. I'm CEO of a company called Container Trade Statistics, probably the sexiest name in shipping. It says what it does on the tin. We're a company that represents the global container shipping businesses, and we take their data, coming straight off the manifest, and reproduce it as market information for them, and we sell it to third parties, anybody who's interested in container shipping. What I want to do is to try and paint, following on from Max's interesting presentation, is just talk a little bit about how container shipping is important to the supply chain, as I'm sure you all know, but I think to try and put some of the numbers to it and just the sheer quantity of value that's moving in containers. You know, we talk about could shipping ever stop? You know, it's not so far from the reality. If you look at what's happening, I've just put a few examples up on here. Each one of these events has had a dramatic impact on global trade. And each one of them tells us a lesson about how risk is managed by BETOs or big retail companies or whatever, anybody, and I'll go through some industries in a minute. But each one of these challenges has had to have people adapt. How do we get that supply chain? Because the supply chain is tight. Each business tries to use container shipping as a floating warehouse. And to minimize their costs, they stretch that to the absolute limit. And that is why you see many of the things happen. And I'm going to sort of talk to you through some of the impacts of that. I think it would probably be easier to say which industry isn't affected by global container shipping nowadays. You know, when I started in the industry, you could guarantee that containerization would be growing at 3 times GDP, primarily because it was conversion of bulk. Anything that could be packed in a container that wasn't was put in a container. That stopped in around 2008. When effectively GDP and container growth effectively generated has been pretty much in line with GDP growth. In fact, actually at the moment, it's slightly going below that level, which is an interesting analysis in its own right. But every single one of these industries has been dramatically affected by each one of those events. And I think, you know, when you want to ask yourself the question, what would happen if it stopped? Many of the answers are sitting in the way that these companies or these industries reacted to that moment. So let's try and put some figures around this. With the very great help of UNCTAD and the gentleman around me, I managed to get... So what I've tried to do here is to try and put together what is carried in container shipping and match it with a number of physical boxes that are used to measure it. So global trade for 23 versus 2019 grew from 19 trillion US dollars to 23.8. The using Max's number, I'm glad his number and my number, it's probably because it comes from the same place, 70% of trade is seaborne trade. And of that 70%, around 60% globally, and it does vary between regions, is covered in containers. So if you apply that, we're looking at around $10.3 trillion of global trade in 2023 was carried in containers. And that's our job as container traders. We are trying to always to put together what is the global market of containers. And in 2023, we've done some recent adjustments. It's around 173.5 million containers are moved every year. So they're the sort of massive overall numbers. And you can see here that when you convert that, what we've tried to do is, what is the average value of each of those containers? So in 2023, we reckon that the average value of goods in a container was about $59,000. Now, that seems like a reasonable number. It varies per region, and it slightly depends on if I could have all afternoon, I could spend a lot of time telling you how each region builds up and what commodities make it up. We don't have that time this afternoon, but it's fascinating to see what happens when you do. So I've then tried to say, well, if it stopped for a day, how many containers wouldn't move? And that's around 475,000 containers every day are lifted on or lifted off vessel in ports. In your map, Max, earlier. So every day, 500,000. So it's 3.5 million a week, and you can just keep going the numbers. Around 14.5 million containers a month moved. So it doesn't take very long to see how the backup, when it does stop. So if you take events like Ever Given, you take things like Los Angeles during COVID, it's a very short time scale between a stop or anything that creates a diversion, like the Red Sea, and how that impacts this industry and everybody else's. So we then worked out that, every day, $22.7 billion worth of cargo is being moved in that 5,475,000 containers. And, on a monthly basis, I think we worked out that there was something like 8.5% of world trade in the entire year would stop. So we're talking massive numbers. And just to give you some reality to this, because, you can think this is just a theory. But if you look at what happened at the end of only December, when the Red Sea disruption started, the global index, so we take the invoices off the container shipping vessels, and we analyze the value of that 1 month to the next. Between the last week in December and the last week in January, the average invoice went up by 24%, not just in the trades that were affected, but globally. From Asia to Europe, it went up 70%. And if you went from India to Europe, it almost doubled in 4 weeks, purely because that cargo was being disrupted and moved around the Cape of Good Hope. Now, not all of that is operation. It's perception, because people were concerned after COVID that might happen, but it's settled down, but it's just coming back up now. I think when we get to March, April's numbers, we're going to see an even bigger rise. So it's a dramatic impact. Just small things like we hadn't stopped anything. We've just taken longer to get there. The import value of containers, we tried to then look at, which areas things. So Europe imports something around 2 trillion value of containers, primarily electronic and consumer goods around the world. But Asia, and we forget this, is twice that. The imports into Asia are nearly $4 trillion a year. And the growth, and if you look at these graphs, what we've tried to do is plot the average value of imports in each container by region. And I won't go all through these because it takes a bit longer, but it's a fascinating graph because it shows you how each region's import varies depending on the commodities that it's trying to import and its stage. But it just shows you that, you know, each region has different impacts depending on the type of cargo it's importing. On an export basis, you see very different, primarily because you see quite a lot of the nature of the goods, particularly sub-Saharan Africa, South America, has very constant growth through this period despite COVID, etc. And if you look at the exports, it's a much smoother line, and that's because exports tend to be less demand impacted than on the import side. But again, I won't go into that, but it's fascinating to take that down into further things. So just to conclude, I think we've seen sufficient blockages, we've seen sufficient things happen in the last, you know, my list is only a 4-year list, and we've had 6 major disruptions to the global supply chain. You know, I always remember when Ever Given got stuck in the Suez, and it sounds like a lifetime ago. I don't like to say this, and those who, you know, the global container shipping lines won't thank me for saying this, but I think it was one of the most wonderful things to happen because it brought container shipping, and the fact that those Christmas goods weren't going to get to Europe, it brought it down to the reality that this, as you said, not understood industry came to life. And everyone said, "Does that how we get our goods into the shops?" And, you know, and I think, you know, since then, I think, you know, we've seen it constantly shown how that is the life stream of global trade. There's been a lot of talk about nearshoring. I think I must have been asked the question to prove data on nearshoring at least 5 or 6 times in the last 3 weeks. I haven't seen any significant. And to be honest, my feeling is it, you know, like 3D printing, it nibbles away. I think you were saying this morning that, you know, global shipping, it will continue. It's very difficult to see how our economies and our way of life could ever sing without shipping. You know, you might want to stop it, but in reality, it has become something which we can't withdraw from. There are ebbs and flows. China is still dominant. India is emerging significantly. And, you know, as I keep saying to those who buy our data, Europe and North America are receding in importance. And the different change, it was interesting, I was talking to Jeffrey Condon this morning from McKinsey, who did a presentation, and you saw it. And we were looking at how foreign direct investment affects container exports. And there's a direct, if not necessarily, is a correlation, I'm not saying yet it could be proved, between FDI and export movements. And I think you can start to see that in the ebbs and flows. And the major change in throughput into Nigeria, Brazil, Western Africa, East Africa, Eastern Coast, South America, and India in the last half of 23 is a very notable change in the way that global shipping is moving on. Max talked about environmental issues. This will affect it, and the container lines are doing everything to make their customers believe they're being the most environmentally friendly. I think we've got a long way to go, but they will find solutions in the end. Suffice to say, I think, you know, it goes to show that this is an industry which is vital, and POPs doesn't really understand the true nature of its business to those around it. I'll leave you with one thought. When COVID happened, I had many risk managers rushing to me saying, "Gosh, our global risk register didn't include logistics." And I think C-suites were on us everything. How, you know, what do we do? And it's been a fascinating change, how risk management for shipping and logistics has gone to C-suite agendas, and that's probably the biggest and important thing that's happened in shipping in the last 5 years. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Nigel and Max. The PowerPoints will be made available on the website. I don't promise today. We are all somewhat overworked, but it'll be available. So thank you for these introductory thoughts. A quick response on this nearshoring, friendshoring, and so on. We also get this question. And I have to acknowledge UNCTAD colleagues in the trade division. Well, for the nearshoring, in fact, Max had a chart at the distance for different commodities. And if anything, distances are going up. no? Because, say, Egypt no longer buys that much grain from Ukraine, but instead buys it from Brazil and the US. Russian oil no longer goes that much to Europe, but goes to India and China. So these commodities distance go up. Container, the long-term trend had been a decline in distance because more and more intra-regional, intra-Asian trade. But now with the Suez, the distances even on containers are going up again. So near-shoring and shipping, we don't see it. And shipping is very happy about it because what really matters is the demand for ton miles. No? So with this description of what crisis did we already have, what shipping means in terms of numbers for different regions, for different commodities, the question that we are asking us for our study is really, okay, what would happen if shipping stopped? In terms of actual trade, there are three options for each individual trade. Either I go to another mode of transport. Yeah, I move iron ore from Brazil to China by air transport. No. But for some commodities, there is. Yeah, but during COVID, there were items I really needed my iPhone for Christmas or a spare part or medical, and then there was a surge in demand for air transport. The second alternative is produce locally, which may work for some things, but I do have my doubts if Tuvalu can produce local Volkswagen. It's difficult, yeah. So there is this alternative, what if not? No, and that is really about what our project wants to look at. What we will try to see what can be substituted through local production or alternative modes, but also with all this dependency, what does it mean for food security, for fuel, for globalized production? And then we look at 1 day, 1 week, 1 month, 1 quarter, and at some point in time, all ships will have arrived in port, and it will be, bad. So in terms of how bad will it be, we now have half an hour left, and the idea is really to pick the brains. I have a list somewhere here on my screen, the sequence we had agreed. Sorry, where do I have my sequence that we had agreed? So we start with Onno, Elio, Rohan, Gino, and George will have the final word, our partner in this project. And as I said, there's no right or wrong, and really nobody has the complete picture. But Onno has some other data, others have some experience. So the idea, really, we have 5 people, 25 minutes, maximum 5 minutes, ideally less, so that we might even have inputs from the group. And we have to use this microphone because there's one of these cables broken, so none of these works. Onno, I give you the microphone.
Okay. So what would be the world without shipping? Good question. Well, without shipping, there would be no trade, I guess. Without trade, there would be no development. We would be in a world where each country can only consume what they produce inside their borders. They are not able to exchange their production with the goods which they would like to have from outside. They could not develop sophisticated production lines where they have to get inputs from all over the world. I guess it would be a difficult world. Maybe there would be less dependencies, especially in the food sector. Maybe we can say if I'm heavily dependent on the grain from Ukraine, suddenly there's a war. I have high rising food prices. If I had prepared my economy in a way that I produce everything in food locally, okay, maybe I would be more safe. But for sure, I wouldn't have this level of development, I would say, to produce technical, high-tech goods, which really help me to be competitive on the world market and to receive the earnings I need to buy really the goods which I want and which help me for the development and which then help me also to raise the education level of the society, to have a welfare system, to have infrastructure, and then I have technologies and all these and reinforcing processes will follow. nowadays, I think our world is heavily connected. We source goods worldwide. The global value chains go over thousands of kilometers. I'm happy that there was mentioned a new data set, which is a trade and a transport data set, which is a very good choice. Tomorrow, everybody can use it online. It will be published on the UNCTAD online database. I had a look in this data a little bit before the session. And just to give a number, for each US dollar exported by a country, I need a transport work of maritime transport of 4 ton kilometers. Or that means I have to move 1 ton over 4 kilometers, or 1 kilogram over 4 kilograms over 1,000 kilometers for each single US dollar which I export. For SIDS, the value is twice as high. For Caribbean SIDS, even a little bit higher. But I think this gives a little bit an indication how much we are reliant today on international trade, and especially on maritime trade, transport.
Thank you also for being brief, because that allows us, hopefully, for some further thoughts. Elio, let me throw the microphone at you.
Yeah. Thank you, Onno. That was inspiring, and what I got out of that was that without shipping, half of the world would starve and the other half would freeze. And I'm sure Jan's heard that many times before. I have a little bit of mixed feelings about this research. Not that I don't like it. I think it's an important bit of research, but it sounds a little bit like, you know, a boyfriend or a girlfriend you're in a long-term relationship with, and then you find out that they might not be that into you, and they're looking at these alternatives. You know, what other a new partner can I get? Because I'm not really very satisfied with this one. Because obviously you've given these options about plane transport modes, producing locally, right? Why are you trying to get away from us? We've been in this together for so long. But nevertheless, I'm kidding. I obviously see the value to this. And then you might want to consider, actually, as a potential follow-up, which I think would be really helpful, is actually to understand what is the value of shipping to different economies. Because I think that is one thing that we are missing, getting that better understanding of actually what shipping means in actual value terms. So that would be quite an interesting piece of research, I think. In terms of a lot to unpack in terms of what both Max and Nigel laid out, one thing I will sort of add a little bit of color. Max talked about 89% of world fuel imports going by sea. We did a research recently, and in terms of shipping actually enabling the transition of other sectors, which Jan mentioned, we're looking at about 50% of those, the energy needs of other sectors being transported on ships. So we've got a responsibility not only to decarbonize our own industry, but actually to help other sectors to decarbonize themselves. So that's why within ICS we work on many different initiatives, and one of the initiatives we're actively working on is this clean energy marine hub. So talking about how do we position these hubs that will be the providers of those alternative fuels of the future. So I think a lot of the time, and I'm glad that in this presentation, and both the presentation from Max and from Nigel, you were both really very positive and quite passionate, which I really appreciated. And because I was a little bit downtrodden, if I can be so honest, because I heard, for example, one comment yesterday talking about how shipping and the energy sector have made $4 trillion last year. And I think everyone around me went like, whoa. You know, but when basically you had two sectors that have been lumped together, one that makes a lot of money, one that makes money. I'm not saying it doesn't make money, but I think the dynamics of shipping, you don't just have the behemoth companies. You do also have family-run companies, some with them with mortgages, you know. And then I think I need to say something as well about the workforce. And without shipping, it's easy just to look at those ships and what they transport. But what about those people that are working in there? We've got about, I think it's 25 odd people currently held in the Middle East from all sorts of nationalities, regardless of what anyone's stake is in the conflict. This is neither here nor there, but those are human beings that are from the Philippines and regions just far away from the conflict, as far removed. And they are facing incredible situations through no fault of their own. The same happened during the pandemic. 400,000 seafarers is the number that we had, unable to go home, unable to replace those that are trying to get home. People stuck on board ships for well over a year, working beyond their contracts. So I think when we talk about what would the world be without shipping, let's not forget, if I can give you a takeaway, what about those people? How find that people angle in there, if that's helpful. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Well, I am probably the only one in this all table with experience where shipping got stuck. I'm not talking about COVID, I'm not talking about the Red Sea, I'm not talking about the Black Sea or anything. We experienced as a country in Sri Lanka kind of complete stoppage due to COVID, political collapse, and then debt collapse, bankruptcy declaration. We are an island. We were an island, and we were an island that is a hub for shipping. The local community, that's what I say, the impact, what would happen, I can really talk about it. The global economy is about $105 trillion now. We are an $80 billion small economy, island economy. I came from Australia and I landed in January, and within 3 months I could see the whole collapse of the economy going through, and suddenly we found no petroleum, no gas, foodstuffs that were coming in, discharge imports, documents not coming in because of the country situation. No LCs could be opened, so ships wouldn't take anything on board. So you get locked out from the rest of the world because you're dependent on your imports. And what happens is social chaos, absolute chaos. So for me, if you ask this question, the whole world stops, a $105 trillion economy of the world stops, and 50% of that goes off suddenly. I think it's World War III. People will come to streets. People have got used to certain things. They do not believe in anything else, what the politicians, they want what they want. They become selfish. They become violent. And we've seen it to our own eyes. We were without electricity. We were without water. It's all because the supply chain broke, completely broke. And the petrol queues, that was whatever the inventory that was there for a very short period, it took like 2 weeks, some people were in the petrol queues get a gallon of petrol. So we are so interconnected, these numbers talk about it. I actually don't want to imagine what it is. It's not about connectivity, it's about a social structure that will immediately collapse. Today, our country's poverty level went down by 50%, went up actually by 50% because of this crisis. So shipping for Sri Lanka was one of the, but absolutely the transshipment still happened because it was not coming to the island. But we experienced without ships what we went through. I really don't want anybody to go through it. Thank you, Jan.
Thank you, Rohan, and really happy to have you on this panel too. Initially, Rohan was scheduled another panel tomorrow, but you have to take a flight, so I squeezed him in here, and I think it's a very good practical addition. So, almost last, Gina, again, other side of the microphone.
It's just to keep things interesting. But yeah, firstly, of course, thank you very much, Jan, for the invitation, and for UNCTAD, of course, for this fantastic conference and bringing us to the Barbados. But Rohan's input and all panelists made a fantastic contribution so far, but it came from the heart, and I think that's where I'll also follow the lead. I mean, when Jan first sent the email and said, this is what I'm going to be asking, I thought, okay, in 30 seconds I can tell you the world without shipping would be a disaster, full stop. But if we look at it in a bit more detail, I think the Barbados Prime Minister yesterday in her opening address, she mentioned a lot of interesting things, of course, but at some point she talked about water scarcity. And I was thinking, you know, the world without shipping would be basically what we take for granted. We take for granted that everything around us comes to us. It arrives more or less in time. We did have some glimpses through the disasters that happened, of course, with COVID, but we do nevertheless take a lot of things of what happened for granted. And just to break that down a bit, I mean, fellow panelists have already said that shipping is, of course, the bedrock of globalization. It's the lifeline of small developing islands. But if we take fuel as an example, yes, we know that if shipping was to stop, fuel wouldn't get to us. And that wouldn't just mean, of course, putting fuel in our own cars, but that would also mean putting fuel in fire brigades, putting fuel in police cars, putting fuel even in garbage trucks, and that's things that don't occur to us. So then that has a ripple effect, of course, and it becomes a public safety hazard and a health concern, right, for the whole countries that it's not delivering to. So it's way beyond just getting fuel to our cars, for example. And these are things that we just take so much for granted. On the supply side again, I mean, all the medical supplies that come to us, the oxygen that comes to hospitals, the medicine, everything more or less comes to us by ship. We saw a bit of this in COVID, and it was quite interesting. I mean, in the UK, for example, I think that probably happened in a few other countries. Every Thursday night we would go out and clap for the nurses and who were key workers and who were taking care of the people in hospitals. And nobody thought about the seafarers, for example, because those nurses needed medicines and supplies, of course, to be taking care of the patients. So it's quite interesting there that people take the industry for granted. I think Nigel did make a valid point there, of course, saying that through COVID, people saw that they started to think that our gifts come by ships. There was a huge debate also in the UK that toilet papers hadn't arrived on time, so we became the vehicle that was delivering toilet papers. But again, it's an essential item and puts things into perspective. We talked also a bit about the human side, but beyond the people that work on vessels, I mean, in the Americas alone, domestic maritime is responsible for around 650,000 jobs. So that's another huge impact of if shipping would stop tomorrow, what would happen to all of those jobs? And I think another, basically the way I like to describe it, shipping powers everything that comes to us, right? Anything that you think of, your pet supplies foods. Imagine having to wait for months on end to be able to get pet food for your pets, or bicycles, or anything you order. But another important thing that I would like to say here, and maybe it comes back, I'm going to pick up on Helio's point on the girlfriend-boyfriend analogy there that he used, and trying to find alternative means of transport. As an ESG strategist, because that's what I do, environmental, social, and governance. So on another note, I mean, shipping is the most environmentally friendly means of transporting cargo, right? So if a world without shipping, even if we did find an alternative solution, it would have a much huger impact on the climate. We're already lagging behind when it comes to reaching those targets. So imagine not being able to utilize the most environmentally friendly means of transport and having to find other alternatives. So I think that in itself says a lot about how important the shipping industry is, and how I like to say we have a duty to sustain it sustainably. And on a final point, I mean, coming on to this, just to explain the impact, I don't know how many of you might have seen the Apple ad that was launched, I think, about 8 months ago, and the CEO was Mother Nature coming into the boardroom to have an update on what sustainability initiatives they were doing at Apple. It was quite an interesting ad. If you haven't watched it, it's worth a watch. But one of the things they mentioned in those points is that now we transport most of our products by ship, and that's reducing our carbon footprint by 95%. So yeah, again, I think a world without shipping would mean a much more worse effect on the climate impact, and that would of course affect especially the smaller developing island nations, but the whole world. And yes, it would just be the things that we take for granted would not arrive to us in time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gina. Last ping pong on the other side. George, I think you want to speak about some legal aspects, no? George is professor at World Maritime University dealing with legal aspects, but he's a nice guy.
Well, thank you, Jan. In the interest of time, of course, I have to be very brief and succinct. First, I must commend Jan, because putting together such a big event, honestly, it takes a lot of time, and also to coordinate things. And by serendipity, we had that project, and we managed to introduce it. And that, of course, is very important. Now, all ideas start really with pertinent questions. You have to have a question. In the scientific world, we call them research questions. We start with research questions. So that project started, of course, with a main question, which is really, what would the world be like without shipping? What if shipping stops? Now that, of course, you can answer it in a fragmented manner, and in the interest of time, I would try to throw light on the legal dimension. What does that really mean? It means when one thinks that 80 to 85% of the goods travel by ship, it means that if we look around this room, 8 of these objects have traveled by ship. And if we eliminate shipping, 8 out of 10 of these objects would not exist in this room, which makes it really hard. Now, the legal dimension. The realistic dimension was really brought very well by the speaker sitting next to me. The legal dimension. All the transactions, all the sales, meaning again, 8 out of 10 objects that we see around, they would collapse. Why? Because we would not be able to transfer really complete ownership, because we would be missing the delivery, the constructive delivery, which is done by the bill of lading. Because if somebody sits in another country and he's sending me something, I want to make sure that when I pay him, I hold something substantial in order to be able to get ownership. And that's the bill of lading in most cases, particularly in containers. And therefore, this transaction would not be able to be completed. They would all collapse, these transactions. They would be invalid. And again, in the interest of time, then the question is, suppose for a moment that, yes, shipping stops completely. We take it out of the picture. Forget about this analysis about, if I love you, if I don't. Just eliminate it. What would really happen? For a moment, think yourselves how dependent we are on the objects that we have and the expectations that we have every day that we will find gas. In many countries also, not of course in the Caribbean, there's issues of heat You would not be able to, you would freeze actually. You should go to the office and there are people who would need to use means of transport, which again, they would require some kind of fuel. Then personal objects, the gifts that we do, or the mobiles and everything. Now, psychologically, for a moment, because we are all enjoying these goods, psychologically, if you think that overnight somebody tells you that stops, we have to find other solutions, trust me, we would not have a clear mind to do our work, to do our job. We would be thinking what's going to be happening the next period. Thank you very much for attending.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, I think you all have an amazing moderator because we still have 5 minutes. Do you have anything we forgot in the audience? Dominique, what did we forget? Sorry, Dominique, and then...
Thank you very much. No, super exciting, super interesting. Let me play devil's advocate in the last 5 minutes and ask 2 questions. Can we also think about, and I don't say that this would be good, but in this hypothetical scenario, what would be benefits? What could be imagined that would be beneficial, be it for us, be it for the planet? Sorry, it's the most environmentally friendly, but it does emit greenhouse gas emissions, it does emit air pollutants and so on. What would be the benefits that also need to be taken into consideration? And I understand now that basically the world would collapse tomorrow already. But I also think that countries, companies, even individual households do have supplies. They do have reserves. They do have warehousing and so on. How quickly would the world collapse? Tomorrow or in a week's time? Or how long would it take that? Or let's say, how long could we reasonably stop shipping without triggering World War II? 3. Sorry, yeah.
So my question is, obviously, without shipping, the world is not imaginable, but how about less shipping? Nobody talks about, we talk about net zero sustainability. At some point, if we need to reduce, probably, the amount of oil we transport, the amount of food we transport, who said we need avocado all year round? We don't have to do that. And if we have solar panels, we don't need to transport oil that much. So is the world of shipping ready to get like 10% cut in order to make a more sustainable world?
I think I speak pretty loudly, but we'll see. It's for the recording. Oh, it's for the recording. Okay, Jan, hi. It's good to see you again. I'm in the shipping business. I happen to be one of the main Caribbean shipping companies that supports all of the Caribbean. And so that question for me was a little intriguing. So here's my response to that. I now tell people that your babies, your new babies, what's the first word you want them to say when you have a new baby? Mama. And Dada. It's now, where the heck is my formula? That darn supply chain. The idea behind this is that it's life. We created this need and this desire. We formulated strategies to figure out how to make our world better. We're now at this stage where making it better is trying to do what we have to do to take care of seafarers, take care of the women who are running the ships today, the women who are going to be captains more and more. What would the world be like? Well, I'm from the Caribbean, so I can only speak to the Caribbean. And Jan, you know my passion. You and I did an incredible session last year. You were in Sweden because we couldn't get you over to wherever we wanted you, down in Miami. The question is, what are the innovations that we must put in place so that question will be answered? We can't do without shipping. We are now in this space, in this global space, and we must find a way to solve the issues by being innovative. As one of the larger carriers in the Caribbean, that's what we're doing. Our ships are better designed. We're applying technology. We're learning from what the ports need to do, and so forth and so on. And I could stay here and talk about that, but the answer is, where is my formula? That's what babies are asking. Thank you. You should wrap it up, Gia.
Yeah, I want to make a comment.
There's a session coming. Sorry, I'm really... I can use the microphone now? Okay, well, I have this one in my hand. Thanks. So the mics seem to be working. No, I'm really, really sorry. I would love to continue, but you have to be a good example as organizer. I've told all the moderators to finish on time for the benefit of the subsequent sessions, which started 40 seconds ago. No, thank you all very, very much. Thank you, presenters. Thank you, panelists. For me, that was even more interesting than I had hoped. I've taken 5 thoughts which I did not have that clear in my mind for the study that George, Max, Simone, and myself are working on. Some came out of some of the comments of the boyfriend, so on the breakup. Like we need to distinguish somehow between the costs of the transition and the negative or worse final situation. So the transition will definitely be negative and costly. To what extent you can somehow get back to not that, but it's tricky. Second point, the value of shipping to the providers, the human aspect. That's something, yeah, I think we have some paragraphs on this already scheduled, like what will the Filipino seafarers lose, what will the Greek ship owners lose, what will the Korean shipyards use, the UK insurance, so the Liberia flag, so there will be income lost. Third point, I think the Sri Lanka case and some of the other cases, and also if you have specific cases, drop us an email and it helps enrich our study. This issue of not the fuel for the normal, but this, of course, it's also fuel for police and hospitals. So really the social unrest is very possible very soon. And of course, I am with here the enthusiast in favor of shipping and a little bit also responding to Besat, no? Your name? Yeah. What about a little less shipping? Well, still today, shipping is less polluting, less emitting than other modes of transport. There are many examples where it is less emitting. Now, I'm biased. I love shipping, no? But getting a bottle of red wine from Chile to Germany costs less CO2 than from Spain by truck. No? So many things that I still think, anyhow, that's not really the question, but another interesting question to internalize externalities. I have to stop here. I want to thank you all very much, and one round of applause to the panelists and speakers.